The author of Harbor Light. 30 years ago, the most celebrated novelist in America stole the book I wrote, put his own name on it, and when I dared to say so, he used every ounce of his fame to convince the entire literary world that I was a bitter liar who'd invented the whole thing. I lost my career, my name, and very nearly my mind. And then 3 decades later, a woman I'd never met opened a box in a university archive and found the one thing he was certain no longer existed. If you've ever watched a powerful man take the truest thing you ever made and dare you to prove it was yours. Stay with me, because the way this ended took 30 years and it was worth every one of them. And before we begin, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because some stories only get their ending when enough people refuse to let them stay buried. My name is Theo Grant. For most of my life, if you'd heard of me at all, it was as a cautionary tale, the man who'd accused a literary giant of theft and been humiliated for it, the embittered failure who couldn't accept his own mediocrity and so invented a grand conspiracy to explain it. That was the story about me. It was a lie, and it cost me everything, and I lived inside it for 30 years. This is the true story, and I get to tell it now, because the truth, however long it takes, has a way of surviving the people who bury it. I grew up poor in a mill town, the kind of place where a black kid who loved books was a small miracle nobody knew what to do with. My mother cleaned houses and brought home the paperbacks people threw away, and I read every one, and somewhere in all that reading, I found the thing I was for. I wanted to write. Not for money, which was good because there wasn't any. I wanted to put the world. I came from my mother's hands, the mill's shadow, the specific ache of wanting more than your town believes you're allowed onto a page, so true that a stranger 100 miles away would recognize their own life in mine. I raised a child through my later years mostly alone after his mother passed. My son's grown. Now a teacher. The first person I ever showed my writing to when he was old enough to read it, and being the parent who stayed taught me the patience it takes to keep faith with the thing for decades before the world admits it was real. I earned my way to a university writing program on scholarship, the only black student in my workshop, and there I met the man who would become my mentor and later the architect of my ruin. His name was Bennett Calloway. Calloway was already famous when I met him, a celebrated novelist, a lion of American letters, the kind of writer whose name appeared on syllabuses and prize juries and magazine covers. I taught one graduate workshop a year, and getting into it was like being knighted. He chose me. He read my early stories and told me in front of the whole workshop that I had the truest ear he'd encountered in 20 years of teaching, and for a poor kid from a mill town whose own town thought his ambition was foolishness, having Bennett Calloway say that was like having God lean down and confirm your existence. I trusted him completely. That trust is the wound this whole story turns on, and I want you to remember it, because the men who do the most damage are almost never strangers. They're the ones you let all the way in. Let me tell you about the mentorship, because I've spent 30 years understanding it, and what I understand now is that it was never mentorship at all. It was harvesting. Bennett Calloway had built his early fame on a certain kind of book-raw, working-class true, and by the time I met him, he had long since stopped being able to write it because he'd spent 30 years in a world of prizes and faculty dinners, and had lost all contact with the kind of life that made his early work matter. He was a lion who could no longer hunt. And then a poor kid from a mill town walked into his workshop with exactly the raw material he'd run dry of. I used to think he chose me because he saw my talent. He did see it, but he didn't choose me to nurture it. He chose me because I had the one thing he needed and could no longer produce, and he spent 2 years positioning himself close enough to take it. Every encouraging word, every trust me with it, every let me place it with my editor, I heard them as generosity. They were a man walking a calf to the barn. The most painful part of being betrayed by someone you trusted completely is that afterward you have to go back through every kind thing they ever did and see it again in the true light. And it's all still there, the whole betrayal, hiding inside the kindness the entire time, and you just couldn't see it because you didn't want to. I spent 2 years writing a novel under Calloway's mentorship. It was called Harbor Light, and it was the best thing I've ever done or ever will do the whole world. I came from my mother's hands, and the mill's shadow rendered as true as I knew how to make it. My mother didn't live to read it. She died the winter I finished the first draft in the house she'd cleaned other people's homes to keep. and I put everything I felt about her hands and her sacrifice and her quiet faith in a son the town thought was foolish into that book. When people ask me why the theft cut so deep, it's a book they say you can write another. That's the answer I can never quite make them understand. Harbor Light wasn't a book. It was the only monument my mother would ever have, and Bennett Calloway carved his own name on it. And for 30 years my mother's whole life sat on the world's shelves as the achievement of a man who never met her. I brought it to Calloway chapter by chapter. He read every word. He encouraged me, guided me, told me it was going to be an important book. Told me to trust him with it, to let him help me shape it, and when it was ready to place it with his own legendary editor at his own prestigious publisher. I gave him the complete manuscript, my only truly finished copy. This was a poor man in the age before everyone had a computer, when a manuscript was a physical stack of paper, and I had exactly one clean one, and I waited dizzy with hope for the great man to open the door to the life I'd dreamed of. The door never opened. Instead, 18 months later, Bennett Calloway published a novel called Harbor Light under his own name. His triumphant return to form, the critics said. His masterpiece. The truest thing he'd ever written, which was accurate because he hadn't written it. I had. He had taken my only finished manuscript, changed just enough to muddy the water, and published my life's work, my mother's hands and the mill's shadow, as the crowning achievement of his celebrated career. The book won the biggest prize in American letters. It is still today on the syllabuses. It made Bennett Calloway immortal, and it was mine. I did the thing you're supposed to do. I told the truth. I went to his editor, to the publisher, to anyone who would listen, and I said, that is my book. I wrote it, he stole it. And I watched in real time the full machinery of a powerful man's reputation turn to crush me. Because here is what I hadn't understood. I had no proof. My one finished manuscript was in Calloway's hands, and he simply denied it had ever existed, said I'd shown him some fragments, some promising early pages that he'd generously mentored, and that I'd become fixated, unstable, unable to accept that the successful book was his and my own attempts had gone nowhere. And I need you to understand the specific genius of how he flipped it, because it's the move that powerful men have used against people like me forever. He didn't just deny the theft, he took my accusation and turned it into the proof of my instability. Think about the trap. The more evidence I gave that the book was mine, the more I could talk about its origins, its meaning, the exact street the mill was on, the more it looked like the obsession of a man who'd studied a great book so closely he'd convinced himself he wrote it. My intimacy with my own novel became, in his framing, the symptom of my delusion. The truer I sounded, the crazier I looked. There is no way out of a trap like that by yourself, because every tool you'd use to prove your sanity is reinterpreted as evidence of your madness. That's why I needed evidence from outside my own head and my own mouth. Bent. He had discontinued paper stock, his own letters. And that's exactly what I didn't have and couldn't get, because the one physical proof was in his hands. He had built the perfect prison, and he'd made me the one holding the only key that had been thrown into the sea. It was my word, the word of an unknown black graduate student, against Bennett Calloway, lion of American letters. There was no contest. The literary world didn't just disbelieve me, it made an example of me. I became the bitter fabulist, the cautionary tale, the man so incapable of accepting his own failure that he'd tried to steal a great man's masterpiece by accusing him of stealing it. Every door in publishing closed. No one would represent me, print me, or say my name without a wince. Bennett Calloway had not only stolen my book, he'd stolen my ability to ever write another one that anyone would read, because he'd made my name a synonym for delusion. I want to be honest about what that did to me, because the men who tell these stories always skip the years in the dark. I lost 30 years, not metaphorically 30 actual years. I stopped writing because what was the point? Every word I put down felt haunted by the book that had been taken. I worked ordinary jobs. I raised my son. I told myself I'd made peace with it, and I hadn't, not for a single day. There were long stretches I could not open a book at all. Could not walk past the front table of a bookstore where Calloway's stolen masterpiece sat in its anniversary editions. Could not hear his name on the radio being called a genius without something in my chest folding shut. The cruelest part of what he'd done wasn't the theft. It was that he'd made me doubt myself. On the worst nights alone, I would wonder if maybe I really was crazy, if maybe I'd only imagined writing it because everyone in the world who mattered had agreed that I had, and a man can only hold a truth alone against the whole world for so long before it starts to feel like a delusion. That's what men like Calloway count on. Not just that you can't prove it, that eventually you'll stop being sure yourself. The one thing that kept me tethered through those years was my son. I'd told him the truth when he was old enough, the whole story, the book, the theft, the ruin, and I'd watched him decide whether to believe his failure of a father over the entire literary world, and he'd chosen me completely without a flicker of doubt, and that choice may have saved my life. He grew up reading a battered carbon of a few surviving early chapters I'd managed to keep. Not the finished book that was gone, but fragments. And he told me once as a teenager, "Dad, I don't care what they say. Nobody who didn't write this could talk about somebody's hands the way you do." He became a teacher, and he taught those fragments to his own students quietly for years, the only place on earth where Theo Grant was known as a writer instead of a cautionary tale. I mention him because when people imagine a man surviving 30 years of being called a liar, they imagine willpower. It wasn't willpower. It was one person who never once doubted me. And one person is sometimes the whole difference between a man who endures and a man who doesn't. I had made my grudging gray peace with dying as a cautionary tale. And then 30 years after Bennett Calloway stole my life, a woman opened a box. Her name was June Ellery. She was an archivist, a rare books and manuscripts archivist at the university library, the same university where Calloway had taught, and where now old and lion-maned in preparing his legacy, he had donated his personal papers to be preserved for scholars, decades of drafts and letters and notebooks, the raw material of a great man's greatness, boxed up and shipped to the archive for June Ellery to process. She was in her late 40s, precise and quiet and stubborn. A white woman from a family of Maine fishermen who'd become the kind of archivist who believes with something close to religious conviction that the job is to protect the truth of the record, no matter whose reputation it inconveniences. And as she worked through the dozens of boxes of Bennett Calloway's papers, cataloging every draft of his celebrated Harbor Light, she found something that stopped her cold. She found a complete manuscript of Harbor Light, an early one, clearly the earliest, the one all his later drafts descended from. And on its title page and in the header of every single one of its 400 pages was a name. It was not Bennett Calloway's name. It was mine, Theo Grant. He had kept it. That's the thing that still astonishes me, the arrogance of it. He'd stolen my only finished copy 30 years ago, and instead of destroying it, he had kept it because to a man like Calloway that original manuscript was the foundation stone of his whole legend, too precious to burn, and he had been so certain of his own untouchability that he donated it, buried in a box among 1,000 others gambling, that no one would ever look closely at the bottom of the pile, or that if they did, no one would believe what they found over the word of a dead lion. He had kept the murder weapon with my fingerprints on it and mailed it to a library. June Ellery could have done what almost anyone in her position would have done. She could have quietly set it aside. Calloway was the university's most celebrated son. His papers were the crown jewel of the collection. His foundation funded her department. Making noise about a manuscript with another man's name on it would inconvenience powerful people and endanger her own career. And she had no personal stake in a 30-year-old scandal about a writer nobody remembered. But June Ellery believed the record was sacred. She looked up the name in the header, Theo Grant, and she found the old story, the cautionary tale, the bitter fabulist who'd accused Bennett Calloway of theft and been destroyed for it. And she understood, holding 400 pages of proof, that the cautionary tale had been telling the truth the whole time, that a terrible wrong had been done to a real man, and that she was now the only person alive who could undo it. So she found me. I remember the day she called. I was an old man by then, retired long past expecting anything from the world. And a stranger's voice on the phone said she was an archivist, that she'd been processing Bennett Calloway's papers, and that she'd found a complete manuscript of Harbor Light with my name on every page, and did I know anything about that? And I had to sit down on the floor of my kitchen, because for 30 years I'd been the only person on earth who knew I wasn't crazy, and a stranger had just called to tell me she knew it too. I wept in a way I hadn't let myself weep in 3 decades. Not for the book, for the simple, unbearable relief of being believed. Do you know what it does to a person to be disbelieved by everyone for 30 years about the one thing they know for certain is true? It hollows out the floor of you. You start every conversation braced for the flicker of doubt, the polite change of subject, the way people look at a man they've decided is a little bit broken. And then a stranger calls an archivist with no reason to lie and no reason to care and says the words, "I'd stopped even praying to hear. I found it. It has your name on it, I believe you." And 30 years of bracing just collapses all at once, and you find yourself on your kitchen floor at 70 years old, crying like the young man you were before they took it, because for the first time since you were that young man, you are not alone with the truth. I have felt a lot of things in my life. I have never felt anything like that phone call, and I hope you never need to, and if you ever have, you know exactly the sound I made. Here is what we built the ruined writer and the stubborn archivist in the year that followed a year of undoing 30. It was not as simple as one manuscript, because Bennett Calloway, though very old, now was still a lion, still surrounded by the machinery of his reputation, still worth defending to a great many people who had built their own careers on being associated with his genius. When June first properly through the correct channels reported what she'd found to the university, the machinery did exactly what machinery does. It tried to make the problem disappear. Her supervisor told her the manuscript was ambiguous, that early collaboration was common, that it would be irresponsible to damage the reputation of a great man and a great collection over a header that could mean anything. She was told gently and then not gently to catalog it quietly and move on. The Calloway Foundation, when it caught wind, moved fast. There were suggestions that the archive should restrict access to that particular box for preservation reasons, which is how the powerful say burn it without saying burn it. June refused, and when it became clear she wouldn't be managed, they came for her the way they always come. A sudden review of her work whispers that she was erratic, obsessed, unprofessional, the exact same playbook that had been run on me 30 years before, because it's always the same playbook. They put her job in danger for the crime of protecting the truth of the record. But June Ellery had one advantage I never had, which was that she was not alone because she had already found me. And I had already spent 30 years learning exactly how this machine worked from the inside of being crushed by it. This time the man with the truth and the person who could prove it were standing on the same side. We did what I had never been able to do alone. We made it impossible to ignore. June, being an archivist, understood evidence in a way no one in my long-ago ruin had. She didn't just have the manuscript, she built the whole architecture of proof around it. She found the paper, the physical paper of my original manuscript, was a specific cheap stock discontinued for decades that could be dated and distinguished from the paper Calloway used in his own confirmed drafts. She found in his own letters in his own archive references from that period to the Grant boys' book and its extraordinary raw material written in his hand before Harbor Light appeared under his name. She found the typewriter my mother had bought me, a battered second-hand machine with a bent lowercase E, and every page of that original manuscript carried the bent EE, and it was not the machine any of Calloway's other work was written on. Brick by patient, Brick and archivist assembled the case that a lonely graduate student never could have, because 30 years ago I'd had only my word, and now I had a professional keeper of records who'd found the physical, datable, undeniable truth in the great man's own boxes. The Calloway Foundation fought harder as we got closer, and the fighting showed me that the man himself was still very much in charge of his own defense, even in his old age. Their lawyers sent June a letter and then me, warning of defamation suits invoking the settled historical record, reminding us both that Bennett Calloway had successfully defended his authorship once already, as if the first time when they'd crushed an unknown student who had no evidence had been a fair fight and not a slaughter. They leaned on the university, which depended on the foundation's money, and the university leaned on June. There was a moment when her supervisor offered her a way out that was almost worse than a threat. He told her that if she'd just quietly reclassify the manuscript as an early collaborative draft of uncertain attribution and stop pushing, the whole thing would go away. Her job would be safe, and no one would have to be embarrassed. It was the machinery offering to let one more truth stay in the box in exchange for everyone's comfort. And June, I will never forget this, looked at her supervisor and said, "You're asking me to lie in the catalog. The catalog is the one place in this whole institution that isn't allowed to lie. If it lies, none of this means anything." She refused, and she knew exactly what refusing would cost her, and she did it anyway. There was a night after the legal threats started when I nearly told her to stop. I called her and I said she'd already done more than anyone had done for me in 30 years, that I couldn't watch a good person get destroyed the way I'd been destroyed, that maybe some wrongs just don't get put right, and we should let it be. And June Ellery went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Theo, do you know why they win? They win because every single person who could stop them decides at exactly this moment that the cost is too high. 30 years ago, everybody who could have helped you did this same math and folded, and that's the only reason he got away with it. If I fold now, I'm not protecting you from anything. I'm just being the next person who chose him over the truth. I won't be that person. I'd rather lose the job." That was the night I understood I hadn't just found an ally. I'd found the one person who had looked directly at the machine that destroyed me and decided, unlike everyone else in 30 years, that she would not feed it. And then we brought it into the light. And this is where 30 years of me being powerless finally reversed. June's discovery, once we took it carefully with a respected literary journalist named Marcus Okonkwo, who had always privately doubted the official story beyond the university's machinery, and into the open, could not be suppressed because it was too solid and too damning and too good a story. The paper analysis. The typewriter with the bent E. Calloway's own letters, my name in 400 headers he'd been too arrogant to destroy. The literary world that had made me a cautionary tale had to look for the first time in 30 years at the actual evidence, and the actual evidence said the cautionary tale had been the victim all along. I saw Bennett Calloway one last time. I hadn't planned to, and June warned me it might undo something in me that had only just healed. But when the evidence was public and the reviews had begun and the old lion was cornered, he asked through an intermediary to meet me. I think he believed even then that he could manage me the way he'd managed everyone for 50 years. So I drove to his grand house on the coast, the house Harbor Light had bought, and I sat across from a very old man in a room full of prizes he'd won with my mother's life, and I waited to feel the thing I'd carried for 30 years. He didn't apologize. Men like Calloway don't even at the end. He tried instead to make a deal. He offered me money, a great deal of money, and a generous acknowledgement, some carefully worded statement about our shared work, if I would agree to soften the story, to let him keep some corner of the legend, to not let his name become the thing it was about to become. And then when he saw that wasn't landing, he said the thing that finally freed me. He said, "You have to understand, Theo, I made that book what it is. In your hands, it would have been a small book by an unknown man. It took my name to make it immortal. In a sense, I gave it more than you did." And I looked at this shrunken, frightened old man, still trying to convince me that stealing my life had been a gift to it. And I felt the 30-year weight simply lift off my chest, because I finally understood that he wasn't a monster. He was small. He had needed my book to be great because he could not be great without it, and he'd spent his whole life terrified that someone would find out, and now someone had, and there was nothing left of him but the fear. I stood up, and I said the only thing I had driven there to say. I said, "My mother cleaned houses so I could write that book. You put your name on her life and you didn't even learn it. I'm not here to make a deal, Bennett. I'm here so that the last new thing you learn is that you lost." And I walked out of the house that my mother's hands had paid for. And I never saw him again, and I have never felt lighter than I did driving away. Bennett Calloway denied it publicly to the end, of course. Even confronted with my name in his own archive, he called it a fabrication, a plant, a conspiracy. The same weapons he'd used on me, but they don't work the same when you're the powerful one being accused, and there's a bent E in the historical record. His publisher launched a review. Scholars who'd built careers on Harbor Light had to face what they'd been teaching, and the prize committee, the one that had made him immortal, convened, examined the evidence June had assembled, and did the thing that had never been done in the history of the award. They stripped it from him, and in an unprecedented act formally recognized me as the true author of Harbor Light. 30 years too late, my name went where it had always belonged, on the front of the truest thing I ever made. I want to tell you about the day my name was restored. Because after 30 years, I had stopped believing in days like it. The prize committee held a ceremony, a strange, unprecedented thing, half correction and half apology, and they invited me to speak. I stood at a podium in front of the very literary world that had spent 3 decades treating me as a delusional liar. The world that had closed every door. And I looked out at the faces of people who had taught Calloway's stolen book, who had reviewed it, who had built pieces of their own careers on his stolen genius, and who now had to sit and look at the man they'd helped destroy. I did not give an angry speech. I had carried the anger for 30 years, and I'd left most of it in Bennett Calloway's grand front room. Instead, I read them the dedication, the one I'd finally gotten to put on the book, 30 years late, from my mother's hands. And I told them who she was. A woman who cleaned houses. A woman who brought home the paperbacks other people threw away. A woman who believed in a son when the whole town thought his ambition was foolishness, and who died before she could see her life become a book, and whose life had then sat on their shelves for 30 years under a stranger's name. You didn't just believe a lie about me, I told them gently, which was somehow worse than if I'd shouted. You let my mother be erased. All it would have taken any time in 30 years was for one of you to look at the evidence I begged you to look at. It took an archivist who owed me nothing. I hope you'll remember that the next time it's easier to believe the powerful man. The room was silent. Some of them wept. It did not give me back the 30 years, but it gave my mother her name, and that was the only thing I'd ever actually been fighting for. The discovery changed more than my own story, and I'm proud of that part. June's case became a landmark in the archive world, a lesson taught now to young archivists about exactly this, about the duty to protect the record against the reputation of the powerful, about how many truths sit unexamined in the bottoms of boxes because looking would inconvenience someone important. Other scholars, emboldened, began re-examining other convenient histories. And a small fund was established in my mother's name for working-class writers, the poor kids from mill towns with more talent than money, and no Bennett Calloway to trust or to fear, kids who now have somewhere to send their manuscripts that isn't the mouth of a lion. Calloway didn't go to prison. He was too old, and the theft was too many decades past for the law to reach, in the way it reaches a fraud caught fresh. But something happened to him that a man like Calloway feared far more than a cell. He lost the one thing he had sold his soul for, the only thing he had ever actually wanted, which was to be remembered as great. His name, which he had made immortal on the back of my book, became instead immortal as the greatest literary thief of his generation. Every syllabus dropped him. Every honor distanced itself. The lion of American letters spent his last years watching his legend curdle into a cautionary tale, the exact fate he had engineered for me. And he died not long after as the man who stole Harbor Light, which is the truest sentence anyone ever wrote about him, and he wrote it himself with 30 years of theft. Now I've told you about the long dark and the reckoning. Let me tell you about June, because the strangest gift in this whole story is that the truth didn't just give me back my name. It gave me at an age when I'd stopped expecting anything of life. There was a night that turned it, though I was too old and too cautious to name it at the time. We'd been working late in the archive, and June told me why the record mattered so much to her, why an archivist's quiet job had become a kind of faith. Her father had been a fisherman, and there'd been an accident at sea, and the company had written it up in a way that blamed her father and cheated her family of what they were owed, and there had been no record to fight it with, nothing written down. Just the company's word against a widow's. I decided when I was young, she said, that I would spend my life making sure things got written down truthfully, so that what happened to my mother couldn't keep happening, so that when the powerful tried to write their convenient version, there'd be a record that said otherwise, and somebody whose whole job was to protect it. And she looked at me across the boxes and said, "You're not a case to me, Theo. You're the reason the job exists. You're what happens when there's no record and no one to guard it. I've been waiting my whole career without knowing it for exactly this box." And I understood that June Ellery hadn't stumbled onto my story. She'd spent her whole life becoming the one person capable of ending it, for reasons that had started long before she ever heard my name. I didn't say anything foolish, but that was the night an old man who'd stopped believing in second chances started quietly to believe again. We fell in love the slow way, the only way two careful people who've been burned can over boxes of paper and long phone calls, and the shared painstaking work of assembling a truth 30 years buried. For most of that year, I didn't let myself see it. I was an old man being handed back his life, and she was the person handing it to me, and you don't examine your own heart in the middle of a resurrection. But somewhere in all those hours watching June Ellery risk her own career, her own good name, her own security to protect the truth of a record about a man she'd never met and a scandal she had no stake in, I understood that I had found the rarest person there is. Not someone who loved me, Someone who loved the truth so much that she'd fight for it even when it would have been so much easier, so much safer to let one more inconvenient fact stay in the bottom of a box. And it turned out that loving the truth that fiercely and loving me were in the end the same act, because the truth she'd fought for was me. She never once let me be grateful, which is how I knew. When I tried in my careful way to thank her for giving me back my life, she looked up from a folder and said, "Theo, I didn't give you your life back. It was always yours." Bennett Calloway just had it in a box in my building, and my whole job, the only job I've ever had, is to make sure the record tells the truth about who made what. I didn't do you a favor. I did my job. The tragedy is how many people whose job it also was chose not to. And I looked at this woman who believed a header on a page was worth risking everything to protect. And I understood that I had spent 30 years thinking the world had no room in it for someone who would simply stubbornly refuse to let a lie stand, and that I had been wrong, and she was proof, and she was sitting across a table from me. The night the prize was formally restored, after the calls and the disbelief and my son crying on the phone from 3 states away, June and I sat together in the quiet of the archive where she'd found me, surrounded by the boxes, and I told her the truth. I'd been too stunned to say that she was the bravest and most honest person I'd ever known, and that after 30 years of believing my one great love was a book that had been taken from me. I'd been astonished to discover this late that the great love of my life was going to be a person, and that it was her. And June Ellery, who is not a woman given to displays, got something in her eye she'd deny, and she said, "Well, it's in the record now." And then she kissed me among the boxes in the room where the truth had finally been found, and it was the beginning of the only part of my life I'd have relived by choice. We married the next spring, 2 people well past the age when the world expects such things, in a small ceremony where my son gave a toast and read the dedication I'd finally, 30 years late, gotten to put on the front of Harbor Light from my mother's hands. June retired from the university she'd made it by then, an uncomfortable place for a woman who'd exposed its favorite son. And we moved to a weathered house on the Maine coast, near the water her family had fished for generations. And there, at 70 years old, I did the thing I had not done in 3 decades. I wrote again. A new book, my own name on it from the first page. It will never be Harbor Light. You only get one book that's your whole soul. But it's true, and it's mine, and June is the first person who reads every page, marking it up in an archivist's careful pencil, protecting the truth of the record right down to the comma. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry, that it took 30 years, if I resent all the life the theft cost me, the books I never wrote, the career I never had, the decades in the gray. And the honest answer surprises them. I'm not, or not much, and not anymore, and here's why. If Bennett Calloway had never stolen Harbor Light, I'd have been a moderately successful novelist, and I'd have written my books, and I'd have lived a normal literary life, and I would never have met a fisherman's daughter who believed the record was sacred, and I would never have known what it is to be believed by one stubborn person against the entire world, and I would never have understood the way I understand now that the truest thing in a life isn't the monument you build. It's the people who refuse to let a lie about you stand. I lost 30 years in a career, and I'd have traded them all again gladly for the walk out of Calloway's front room. Feeling light, and the phone call that put me on my kitchen floor, weeping to be believed, and a careful pencil marking up my pages by the water at the end of my life. The theft took my book. It could not touch the part of my life that turned out to matter most, and that part came impossibly out of the theft itself. A powerful man stole the truest thing I ever made and spent his whole life daring me to prove it was mine, and for 30 years I couldn't, and I nearly came to believe I'd dreamed it. But my mother taught me what a true sentence sounds like, and a stubborn archivist believed that the record is sacred, and it turned out that the arrogance of the powerful Calloway's certainty that no one would ever look at the bottom of the box is the very thing that buries them, because he kept the proof, and one honest woman opened the lid. 30 years is a long time to hold a truth alone against the whole world. But the truth doesn't have an expiration date. It just waits in the bottom of a box for one person stubborn enough to lift it into the light. 30 years I waited. I would have waited 30 more. The lie was patient, but the truth was more patient, because the truth had my name in the header, and June Ellery had a conscience, and between those two things, a powerful man's whole legend finally came apart. If this story meant something to you, do me that favor from the start. Subscribe, because some stories only get their ending when enough people refuse to let them stay buried, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to hold a truth alone that no one would believe? I read every single one. And stay close, the next story I've got begins in the last place you'd expect to find a secret worth killing to keep, and it holds you all the way to the end.